Have you ever thought a $15 folding chair could blow away $850 million in under 48 hours? I did not have to think it. I made it happen. In the ruthless world of corporate empires, their fatal flaw often lies in how they treat the lowest person in the boardroom. Listen closely. I am going to teach you to never judge anyone by their assigned seat. Hello to the wonderful audience of Boss Revenge Stories. We want to sincerely thank you for your constant support, but unfortunately, YouTube has disabled our monetization, leaving us without the budget to continue uploading new videos here in the near future. We are transitioning our operations to Patreon, so if you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us by joining our Patreon community where you will find exclusive, true stories that are even better, significantly longer, and feature highly detailed situations we cannot make public on YouTube, all brought to life by multiple emotional voice actors. You can join by scanning the QR code on your screen or by clicking the Patreon link in the video description or pinned comment. Now, let us begin today's story, where you will meet a woman named Savannah Powell. The air on the 60th floor of the Etherius Dynamics headquarters in Austin, Texas, always smelled of expensive cologne and unfiltered arrogance. This was a green energy startup built on trendy buzzwords, slick presentations, and the massive egos of its founders. Today was supposed to be the crowning achievement of their rapidly growing empire. The smart glass walls of the central boardroom were dialed to perfect transparency, offering a sweeping, godlike view of the sprawling Texas skyline. But the real spectacle was inside this crystal sanctuary. The executive board was preparing to finalize the signing of an $850 million federal grant, a massive injection of taxpayer capital meant to fund a state-of-the-art fuel cell gigafactory. The room was a monument to their premature victory. At the center sat a solid, single-slab marble conference table that easily cost more than a typical suburban family home. I am Savannah Powell. I am 38 years old, and on that particular morning, I walked into that aggressively modern room wearing a modest, off-the-rack gray suit. In my right hand, I carried a heavy, worn leather briefcase with slightly frayed corners. To anyone looking at me, I was utterly unremarkable. A drab shadow passing through a room full of brilliant light. That was precisely the point. I had been introduced to the board simply as an independent risk assessment consultant. I was there to observe, to verify, and to ensure that the monumental sum of federal money was going into responsible hands. As I stepped through the heavy glass doors, the atmosphere was thick with celebration and self-importance. Julian Vance, the charismatic chief executive officer, was holding court in the far corner of the room. He was flashing his blindingly white teeth for a select group of media photographers, aggressively shaking hands and securing his image as the visionary savior of renewable energy. Across the room from him was his wife, Eleanor Vance. She held the title of Chief Strategy Officer, a position secured entirely through her father's deep political connections rather than any actual strategic competence. Eleanor was draped in high-end designer silk, her sharp eyes scanning the room as she reviewed the exclusive guest list with a deeply condescending sneer on her flawless face. I made my way towards the sprawling marble table, intending to take one of the plush, ergonomic leather chairs meant for the meeting participants. Before I could even reach out to pull the chair back, Eleanor caught sight of me. She abruptly stopped her conversation with a junior executive, offered a hollow, chilling half-smile, and tapped a heavy, diamond-encrusted pen against the pristine marble surface. The sharp clinking sound cut through the low murmur of the room, immediately drawing the attention of several executives. Eleanor did not even bother to look me in the eye when she spoke. She raised her perfectly manicured hand and pointed her diamond pen toward a cramped, shadowed corner of the room, right next to a brushed chrome recycling bin. Your seat is over there. Paper pushers do not sit at the same table as the elite architects of the future. I turned my head to look at where she was pointing. Sitting in that isolated corner, completely out of place in this temple of modern luxury, was a cheap metal folding chair. It was the kind you might find in a rundown community center or a school cafeteria. The gray paint was peeling off the backrest, and flakes of orange rust spotted the thin metal legs. It was a calculated, deliberate insult. It was her way of physically manifesting the massive class divide she firmly believed existed between us. A few muffled chuckles rippled through the boardroom. The board of directors, a collection of wealthy investors and corporate yes-men, exchanged amused, knowing glances. They enjoyed the show. They loved watching Eleanor put the hired help in their place. However, not everyone was laughing. At the far end of the table, Marcus Thorne, the chief financial officer, shifted uncomfortably in his heavy leather seat. I caught his eye for a fraction of a second. Marcus was the only one in the room who actually looked at the numbers, and he was the only one who seemed to register that something was horribly wrong with this interaction. He frowned deeply, his eyes darting from my face to the rusty chair and back again. My eerie, unbroken calmness unsettled him. He fully expected me to flush with intense embarrassment, to argue my position, or to shrink away in shame. I did none of those things. I did not show a single ounce of anger or frustration. I simply offered Eleanor a polite, tight-lipped nod, turned on my heel, and walked slowly toward the corner. The squeak of my sensible shoes against the polished floor echoed softly beneath the renewed chatter. I reached the folding chair, pulled it open with a loud metallic clank, and sat down. The cold, unyielding metal dug uncomfortably into my back. I placed my worn briefcase carefully on my lap, resting my hands flat against the scratched leather. Then, I slowly lifted my gaze. I did not look at Eleanor, or Julian, or the nervous chief financial officer. I looked straight up at the ceiling, fixing my eyes dead center on the sleek, black dome of the God's Eye, artificial intelligence camera. Aetherius Dynamics constantly bragged about this cutting-edge system to their investors. It was designed to record every word, analyze micro-expressions, and monitor the behavioral dynamics of every single meeting. As the little green light on the camera blinked, silently recording every millisecond of the humiliation I had just been subjected to, a cold, dark sense of satisfaction washed over me. The heavy glass doors slid shut, sealing the room in a hush of climate-controlled perfection. Julian took his place at the head of the colossal marble table, adjusting his tailored suit jacket with a practiced flick of his wrists. The overhead lights dimmed to a cool, theatrical blue as the massive smart screen behind him flared to life. The presentation began, and it was an absolute masterclass in corporate delusion. Slide after slide featured rendering upon rendering of the proposed gigafactory, complete with digitally inserted flying cars and hyper-realistic greenery that defied all laws of botany. Julian spoke with the practiced cadence of a megachurch pastor, weaving a narrative where Aetherius Dynamics was not just a startup, but the sole savior of the human race. He tossed around phrases like paradigm shift, revolutionary synergy, and quantum disruption, deliberately avoiding any actual engineering specifics. They spoke of the $850 million grant from the Federal Advanced Energy Initiative, as if the heavy bricks of cash were already stacked in their personal vaults. There was no discussion of compliance, no mention of the grueling supply chain logistics, and certainly no thought given to the actual taxpayers funding their utopian dream. It was a victory lap for a race they had not even finished running. Marcus Thorne, sitting rigid in his chair, nervously cleared his throat. He opened his thick binder, the only one on the table that contained actual spreadsheets instead of glossy marketing photos. He adjusted his glasses and attempted to steer the runaway train back to reality. He started to outline the mandatory phased allocation schedule for the federal funds, stressing the strict reporting requirements for the first quarter of the year. He barely got through his second sentence before Eleanor raised her hand, her palm facing him in a universal gesture of dismissal. She let out a long, dramatic sigh, as if Marcus were a toddler interrupting a symphony. "Marcus, please, spare us the dreary mathematics," Eleanor drawled, leaning back in her plush chair and swirling the mineral water in her crystal glass. "We are visionaries, not accountants. Besides, we need to focus on the immediate aesthetics of the launch. I have just retained a highly exclusive interior designer from Milan. We are completely redoing the conceptual layout for the main lobby of the factory. I am flying him in on the private jet next week to select the imported Carrara marble for the reception desk. We need an environment that screams innovation, not just some dusty industrial warehouse. Marcus blinked, his face paling slightly. He looked around the table, hoping for some support, but the other board members were either nodding in blind agreement with Eleanor or too terrified of Julian to speak up. "With all due respect, Eleanor," Marcus stammered, his voice lacking conviction, "that capital is heavily restricted. The funds have not actually been disbursed yet. We cannot commit to international design firms. We still need the final authentication signature from the Federal Oversight Agency before a single cent of that grant becomes active. It is a strict legal requirement." Julian threw his head back and let out a rich, booming laugh that echoed off the smart glass walls. He leaned forward, planting his perfectly manicured hands flat on the marble surface, projecting an aura of absolute invincibility. "Marcus, you worry too much," Julian said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Those federal oversight dogs are all bark. I had dinner with the state senator and 2 key committee members just last week. They are firmly in our pocket. The political machinery is fully backing us. These regulatory hurdles you are sweating over, they are nothing but a rubber stamp, a meaningless formality designed to make the bureaucrats feel relevant." From my isolated position in the corner, the cold metal of the folding chair pressing against my spine, I decided it was time to inject a dose of reality into their crystal sanctuary. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I pitched my words in a soft, even tone that cut through the thick layer of their collective ego like a straight razor. Formalities are sometimes the boundary between an empire and a piece of scrap paper. The entire room fell dead silent. Every head snapped toward the corner. For a brief second, they had genuinely forgotten I was even in the room. I kept my hands resting gently on my worn briefcase, my expression utterly blank. If your artificial intelligence system records this blatant lack of respect for corporate ethical standards, that $850 million could evaporate before the dawn of the third day. For a moment, the silence held. Then, Julian snorted. A second later, the entire boardroom erupted into roaring laughter. It was not polite laughter. It was the cruel, mocking sound of the untouchable elite putting a peasant back in their place. Eleanor rolled her eyes so hard it looked painful. She turned to the executive beside her, speaking loudly enough to make sure her voice carried over the laughter. "It is honestly pathetic. These low-wage employees always love to play dress-up and spout dramatic nonsense just to make their miserable little administrative lives seem important." The laughter swelled again. I did not offer a single word in my defense. Let them laugh. The sound of their arrogance was the exact soundtrack I needed. Slowly, deliberately, I opened the brass clasps of my briefcase. The sharp click silenced a few of the chuckles nearest to me. I reached inside and pulled out a single, thick legal document bound in heavy cardstock. I uncapped a cheap red pen and carefully, methodically drew a thick, bold circle around one specific, deeply buried clause on page 42. I stood up, the rusty joints of the folding chair groaning in protest. Without a word, I walked over to the edge of the grand marble table. Stopping right next to the trembling chief financial officer, I placed the open contract face up on the edge of Marcus's pristine workspace. I tapped the red circle twice with my index finger. "I believe I have gathered all the data I require for my risk assessment," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "If you will excuse me, I will be taking my leave early." I did not wait for a dismissal. I turned my back on the billionaires and walked toward the heavy glass doors, leaving the room to stew in its own toxic superiority. The heavy glass doors glided shut behind me, completely sealing off the boardroom. For a long moment, the echo of my footsteps faded, replaced quickly by a fresh wave of derisive snickers. Eleanor Vance took a delicate sip of her sparkling mineral water. A triumphant, venomous smirk plastered across her flawless face. She leaned over to the vice president of marketing, whispering a cruel joke about the cheap fabric of my suit. Julian adjusted his custom-tailored silk tie, entirely unbothered, commanding the room to refocus on the guest list for their upcoming grand opening gala. But Marcus Thorne was not laughing. The chief financial officer sat rigidly at the far end of the sprawling marble table. His gaze was locked on the thick, heavy cardstock document I had left resting precariously on the edge of his pristine workspace. The glaring red circle I had drawn seemed to burn into the stark white paper, demanding his attention. A cold bead of sweat formed at his hairline, tracking a slow, agonizing path down his temple. His throat suddenly felt as dry as sandpaper, with hands that were beginning to tremble with an uncontrollable tremor. Marcus pulled the document closer. He forced his eyes to focus on the dense, tightly packed legal jargon contained within the red ink. It was an addendum, recently drafted and buried deep within the master grant agreement. The bold header read, "Integrity and Anti-Nepotism Clause." Marcus swallowed hard. His heart began to hammer against his ribs, beating a frantic, irregular rhythm that deafened him to the idle chatter of the billionaires surrounding him. The clause was a brutal, uncompromising new federal mandate. It explicitly prohibited any display of favoritism, abuse of corporate power, or failure to maintain rigorous professional respect toward an appointed government envoy. It was designed to completely gut corrupt organizations before a single taxpayer dollar could be transferred. Marcus opened his mouth, but his voice failed him. He tried again, his vocal cords straining against the sudden, suffocating panic. "Any evidence of leadership ethics violations," Marcus stammered out, his voice cracking, slicing sharply through the arrogant banter of the boardroom. The room went quiet, irritated by the sudden interruption. He gripped the edge of the heavy marble table, his knuckles turning stark white, and forced himself to finish reading the sentence aloud. "Any evidence of leadership ethics violations will result in a permanent freezing of funds without prior notice." Eleanor clicked her tongue loudly, slamming her diamond-encrusted pen down onto the table. She threw her hands up in theatrical exasperation. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Marcus, it is just standard bureaucratic garbage. Do you honestly think some mid-level paper pusher is going to freeze our capital because I did not offer her a cup of premium coffee? Stop being so incredibly dramatic." But Julian did not chime in to support his wife. The confident, golden boy smile had completely vanished from his face. A primal, suffocating instinct began to claw at the edges of his mind. He was an apex predator in the corporate ecosystem, and right now, the air smelled exactly like a steel trap. The muscles in his jaw tightened until they ached. His eyes darted to the empty doorway where I had just exited, then back to the terrified chief financial officer. "Marcus," Julian commanded, his voice suddenly stripped of all its theatrical warmth. It was flat, urgent, and laced with creeping dread. "Flip to the last page. Look at the authorized signatures. See who holds the title of the government envoy mentioned in that clause." Marcus obeyed. His fingers were shaking so violently now that he clumsily tore the corner of the heavy paper as he frantically turned it. He flipped past the dense legal boilerplate until he reached the final sheet. At the bottom right corner, pressed deep into the fiber of the page, was the intricate, embossed seal of the Federal Advanced Energy Initiative. Directly beneath that seal, printed in stark, unforgiving black ink, was a name. Marcus felt all the blood drain rapidly from his face. The room seemed to tilt violently on its axis. He could hear his own pulse roaring in his ears, a frantic drumbeat of pure panic. His mouth hung open, but no sound came out. "Read it, Marcus!" Julian barked, slamming his fist down on the marble, shattering the fragile silence into 1,000 pieces. Marcus looked up, his eyes wide and hollow with absolute terror. He looked at Julian, then at Eleanor, whose haughty expression was finally beginning to fracture into genuine confusion. "Savannah Powell," Marcus gasped, his voice barely a whisper, yet it echoed like a gunshot in the pristine, silent room. "Executive Director of the National Budget Allocation Division." The name hung in the air, heavy and lethal. "She is not a consultant," Marcus choked out, a wet, ragged sound escaping his throat. "She is the director. She is the one who signs the checks. She holds the keys to the entire $850 million. The realization hit the room like a physical shockwave. The air grew thick, suffocating, entirely devoid of oxygen. No one breathed, no one moved. The high-definition smart screens displaying their utopian factories suddenly looked like mocking digital tombstones. Julian Vance, a man who had built his entire career on being the smartest person in any room, slumped slightly in his custom leather chair, the color draining entirely from his perfectly tanned skin. Eleanor let out a small, strangled gasp, her manicured hand flying up to cover her mouth. The sheer magnitude of her fatal error crashed down upon her shoulders. The woman she had just exiled to a garbage corner was not the hired help. She was the executioner. Slowly, as if guided by a collective, invisible force, every single pair of eyes in the boardroom drifted away from the massive marble table. They turned toward the shadowed, cramped corner of the room. They stared at the cheap, rusty metal folding chair, sitting completely empty next to the recycling bin. Then, one by one, their heads tilted upward, they looked toward the ceiling, directly at the sleek, black dome of the God's Eye artificial intelligence camera. The tiny, unblinking green light was pulsing rhythmically. It was a silent, damning witness. It had captured every single micro-expression of disgust, recorded every syllable of Eleanor's aristocratic cruelty, and perfectly documented the hostile, deeply unethical culture of Aetherist dynamics. The camera had seen it all, and because of the flawless, automated security protocols Julian himself had bragged about, they all knew exactly where that footage was headed. The relentless machinery of the United States federal government does not operate with dramatic flair. It does not yell, and it does not throw tantrums. It moves with a cold, terrifying silence, an invisible bureaucratic tsunami that swallows corporate empires without a single ripple on the surface. At exactly 8 o'clock the following morning, the first wave hit the 60th floor of Aetherist Dynamics. There were no sirens or flashing red lights. It was merely a single, automated email, entirely devoid of formatting or colorful corporate logos. It arrived simultaneously in the encrypted inboxes of every single board member and high-level executive. The subject line was chilling in its absolute neutrality. Disbursement suspension dash, ethics violation review pending. The body of the text was remarkably brief, consisting of 3 short sentences citing federal regulatory codes. It did not contain any threats or demands. It simply stated that the $850 million grant was locked pending an active internal investigation. Wall Street is a living organism that survives on information, and panic is its most contagious disease. By 9:30 in the morning, when the opening bell rang at the stock exchange, the pristine facade of Aetherist Dynamics began to fracture. It started small, a trickle of shares being dumped by low-level analysts who had heard whispers of a disastrous boardroom meeting. Then, the internal rumors breached the building's airtight confidentiality agreements. The trickle turned into a steady, bleeding stream. Small, relentless sell-offs began to populate the ticker tape, a numerical representation of trust draining rapidly from the company. Inside his expansive corner office, Julian Vance was watching the red numbers slide relentlessly across his dual monitors. The meticulously crafted image of the visionary chief executive completely shattered. He grabbed a heavy crystal Scotch glass from his desk and hurled it violently against the smart glass wall. The glass exploded into a shower of brilliant shards, raining down onto the imported rug. He was a man drowning in his own hubris. Julian lunged for his secure phone, his fingers frantically dialing the private numbers of the Washington power brokers, the lobbyists, and the state senators he had bragged about just 24 hours earlier. "Pick up the phone," he muttered, pacing like a caged animal across the shattered glass. But the political machine is inherently self-serving. The moment his political allies had been quietly notified through back channels that the Federal Oversight Agency had launched a direct, active intervention under the strict anti-nepotism mandate, Julian became instantly radioactive. Call after call went straight to automated voicemails. Secretaries offered hollow, heavily scripted apologies, claiming the senators were unreachable in closed-door legislative sessions. No one in the Capitol was willing to risk their political career to save a man who had publicly humiliated the executive director of the National Budget Allocation Division. Down the hall, in a rapidly assembled war room, A team of high-priced corporate defense attorneys was already shouting over one another. They were men in bespoke suits, who specialized in making massive corporate liabilities disappear. The lead counsel, a ruthless pit bull of a lawyer, slammed his palms on the polished wood table. "We need to purge the local servers immediately," the lawyer barked, his face red with exertion. "Get the information technology department to wipe every single byte of data from that artificial intelligence camera system from yesterday. We will officially claim it was a routine maintenance glitch that corrupted the drive. Without the video and audio evidence, it is just hearsay. We can fight hearsay in a boardroom." Marcus Thorne sat at the far end of the table. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years overnight. His eyes were deeply sunken, carrying the heavy, suffocating weight of inevitable defeat. He let out a dry, bitter laugh that immediately silenced the frantic attorneys. "We cannot delete it," Marcus said, his voice hollow and defeated. "The local servers do not hold the only copy." The lead counsel glared at him, his brow furrowed in anger. "What are you talking about? We own the proprietary hardware." "Do you remember the security audit from last month?" Marcus asked, looking up at the ceiling as if waiting for a final judgment. "The independent risk assessment consultant recommended a mandatory upgrade to our cloud security protocols to comply with federal contractor standards. We implemented it without reading the fine print because we wanted the grant money so badly. That consultant was Savannah Powell. She required a secure cloud layer that completely bypasses our internal network. Every single millisecond of footage recorded by the camera system is automatically backed up, encrypted, and sent directly to the federal agency's secure servers. They already have the tape. They had it before she even walked out of the building yesterday." The war room plunged into a suffocating, absolute silence. The lawyers slowly closed their leather binders, realizing they were completely paralyzed. There was no legal defense against perfect, immutable video evidence securely locked inside a federal vault. In the adjoining executive office, Eleanor Vance was experiencing a complete psychological collapse. The aristocratic sneer, the arrogant superiority, and the mocking laughter were entirely gone. Her flawless designer makeup was slightly smeared, and her hands shook violently as she scrolled through her private corporate email on her tablet. The news of the federal suspension had thoroughly spooked the private equity sector. The institutional investors who had previously clamored to be part of the factory project were now sprinting for the exits. Legal notices of immediate withdrawal were flooding her inbox. One after another, private venture capital firms were triggering their emergency exit clauses. Terrified of being legally entangled in a massive federal fraud and ethics investigation, they demanded their capital back immediately. Eleanor stared at the screen, her breathing shallow and rapid. The untouchable empire she thought she ruled was actually built on a foundation of delicate glass, and a woman sitting on a rusty folding chair had just tapped it with a steel hammer. The invisible clock was ticking mercilessly. The 48-hour window before the federal agency would make a public, official declaration of their findings was rapidly closing. 24 hours had already slipped away. Their phantom fortune, the $850 million they had mentally spent on private jets, Italian marble, and political favors, was evaporating into thin air with every passing minute. They were trapped in a descending elevator with the cables cut, bracing for the devastating impact of the ground. By 11 o'clock that night, the 60th floor of the Aetheris Dynamics Tower was completely dark, save for the harsh, cold fluorescent lights blazing inside the central boardroom. The city of Austin glowed peacefully below them, utterly unaware of the bloodbath about to unfold behind the smart glass walls. When cornered by absolute ruin, the thin veneer of corporate loyalty instantly dissolves, revealing the primal, cutthroat nature of the elite. There is no love, no devotion, and certainly no honor among those who worship at the altar of wealth. There is only survival. In a desperate, frantic bid to salvage the $850 million, Julian Vance and his elite crisis management public relations team had reached a brutal consensus. The Federal Oversight Agency needed a sacrifice. They needed a tangible, highly publicized scapegoat to prove that the company had swiftly identified and eradicated the source of the toxic corporate culture. Julian, A man who loved his empire far more than he ever loved his wife did not hesitate for a single second to choose the victim. The emergency board meeting was called with zero advance notice. The remaining executives sat around the grand marble table, their faces pale and exhausted, their eyes darting nervously around the room. Eleanor Vance swept through the heavy glass doors a few minutes late, clutching a designer handbag, her face twisted in a mixture of extreme stress and residual arrogance. She expected a war council, a strategy session to destroy the government envoy who had dared to threaten them. Instead, she walked right into a firing squad. Julian stood at the head of the table. He did not look at her with the warmth of a husband. He looked at her with the dead, calculating eyes of an executioner. He slid a thick, perfectly bound stack of legal documents across the smooth marble surface. It stopped exactly in front of Eleanor's empty chair. "Sit down, Eleanor," Julian commanded, his voice completely devoid of any emotion. Eleanor frowned deeply, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows knitting together in confusion. She looked down at the documents, then back up at her husband. "What is this, Julian? We do not have time for paperwork. We need a press release to discredit that bureaucrat before the morning news cycle begins." "That is exactly what we are doing," Julian replied coldly. He gestured to the folder. "Those are your termination papers, effective immediately. You are stripped of your title as Chief Strategy Officer, removed from the Board of Directors, and barred from entering any Aetherist Dynamics property. Your access badges have already been deactivated." A heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the boardroom. The other executives stared down at their own hands, refusing to make eye contact with the woman about to be slaughtered. Eleanor froze. The color drained rapidly from her face, replaced seconds later by a furious, burning red flush. Her hands trembled violently as she snatched the documents off the table. "Are you out of your mind? I am your wife. My father secured the initial seed funding for this entire company. You cannot just fire me to save your own skin." "I can, and I just did," Julian shot back, raising his voice to dominate the room. "The federal mandate specifically targets leadership ethics and nepotism. You are the textbook definition of both. You abused your power. You humiliated a senior government official on camera. And you single-handedly jeopardized $850 million of federal capital. You are a massive liability. Eleanor, you are the cancer killing this company. And I am cutting you out to prove to the federal agency that Aetherist Dynamics does not tolerate your toxic behavior." For a moment, Eleanor looked genuinely destroyed. The betrayal was so absolute, so meticulously planned, that it took her breath away. But the despair only lasted for a fleeting second. In the ruthless ecosystem of the elite, wounded predators do not lie down and die. They bite back with lethal force. Eleanor let out a sharp, hysterical laugh that echoed violently off the crystal walls. She slammed the termination papers down onto the marble table and locked eyes with her husband. The aristocratic sneer returned to her face, but this time it was laced with pure venom. "You want to talk about liabilities, Julian?" Eleanor screamed, her voice piercing the air. "You want to play the righteous savior for the federal government? Fine, let us open the books. Let us talk about the $30 million of investor capital you secretly funneled into your offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands last year." Julian stumbled back a step, the confident facade finally cracking. "Shut your mouth. Eleanor, you are hysterical." "I am just getting started," she shrieked, slamming both hands on the table and leaning forward like a striking snake. "How about the inflated supplier invoices? How about the fake revenue projections you forced the accounting department to fabricate just to qualify for this exact federal grant? You are not a visionary. You are a fraudulent, pathetic little con artist. And if I am going down for insulting a bureaucrat, I am dragging you straight into a federal penitentiary for wire fraud and massive embezzlement." The two of them erupted into a vicious, unhinged screaming match. They hurled accusations, confessed to corporate crimes, and viciously tore each other to pieces right there in the crystal sanctuary. They completely destroyed the illusion of their perfect partnership, revealing the deep, rotting corruption at the very core of Aetherist Dynamics. They were so consumed by their mutual hatred and their desperate need to destroy one another that they failed to notice the quiet, terrifying reality occurring at the far end of the marble table. Marcus Thorne, the chief financial officer, sat perfectly still. He was sweating profusely, his tie loosened, his eyes wide with absolute terror. But he was not looking at the fighting couple. He was staring intensely at his own smartphone, which was lying face up on the table, partially hidden behind his leather binder. The screen of the phone was illuminated, displaying an active, ongoing phone call. The call duration timer read 12 minutes and 40 seconds. Terrified of going to prison for the financial crimes he had been forced to help cover up, Marcus had made a choice the moment the emergency meeting was called. He had dialed the direct, emergency hotline for the Federal Ethics and Fraud Investigation Unit. He had invoked the Whistleblower Protection Act. The phone was set to speakerphone mode, its sensitive microphone picking up every single word echoing through the crystal room. Julian and Eleanor were screaming out loud, providing detailed, undeniable, and publicly broadcasted confessions to multiple federal felonies directly into the ears of federal agents. The executives were trapped in a blazing inferno of their own making. The billion-dollar machine was violently crushing itself from the inside out, gears grinding against gears, destroying everything in its path. And somewhere in the city, the woman they had banished to a rusty folding chair did not even have to lift another finger to watch the empire burn. When the sun rose on the morning of the third day, marking exactly 48 hours since I had first stepped onto the 60th floor of Etherius Dynamics, the final judgment was delivered. There were no more closed-door meetings or frantic phone calls. The official federal report was published and immediately picked up by every major financial news network across the country. The headline was devastatingly simple. The Federal Advanced Energy Initiative permanently revoked the $850 million grant. The official statement cited a leadership culture in severe violation of fundamental ethical standards and absolute zero financial transparency. When the opening bell rang on the stock exchange that morning, the bloodbath was instantaneous. Etherius Dynamics stock plummeted 80% within the very first hour of trading. The institutional investors who had not already fled overnight dumped their shares at pennies on the dollar before noon. The remaining board of directors voted unanimously to terminate Julian Vance with cause. He was escorted out of his own crystal sanctuary by federal agents, facing a massive, multi-agency investigation for wire fraud and embezzlement, all courtesy of the live audio feed provided by his terrified chief financial officer. Eleanor Vance suffered an equally spectacular fall from grace. Stripped of her title and facing the terrifying reality of federal prison, she turned entirely against Julian. Their rapid, vicious divorce settlement drained whatever private wealth they had left to pay for their opposing defense attorneys. She lost her immaculate reputation, her high society status, and her fortune, a billion-dollar empire, a monument to unchecked ego and corporate greed, was completely leveled to the ground. And the solitary match that lit the inferno was a $15 folding chair. 6 months later, the air was crisp and cool in Seattle, Washington. I stood outside a set of massive, hand-carved mahogany doors, preparing to negotiate a new green energy initiative. This boardroom belonged to a legacy conglomerate, a company with deep pockets and a reputation for aggressive business tactics. I smoothed down the lapels of my modest, off-the-rack gray suit. I adjusted my grip on my heavy, worn leather briefcase with the slightly frayed corners. Then, I pushed the heavy doors open and stepped inside. The room was a breathtaking display of old money and immense corporate power. The men gathered around the sprawling, solid oak table were all wearing $100,000 bespoke suits. They were titans of industry, men who dictated the flow of global markets with a single phone call. But the absolute moment my sensible shoes stepped onto their plush carpet, the low hum of their conversation instantly died. Every single man in that room immediately stopped what he was doing and stood up. They stood at strict, wavering attention. The newly appointed chief executive officer of the conglomerate, a man known for his ruthless negotiating tactics, did not point a diamond pen at a dusty corner. Instead, he walked briskly from his spot and approached the head of the massive oak table. With a posture of deep, undeniable reverence, he reached out and gently pulled back the grandest, most heavily padded leather chair in the entire room. He extended his hand, explicitly inviting me to take the seat of absolute honor. I looked into his eyes and saw no trace of arrogance. I saw only absolute, unadulterated awe, heavily laced with a very healthy dose of fear. He knew exactly who I was, and he knew exactly what I was capable of doing to people who lacked professional respect. I offered him a gentle, polite smile. I walked over, sat down in the luxurious leather chair, and placed my worn briefcase gently onto the polished oak surface. As the executives slowly took their seats around me, I thought to myself about the nature of true power in corporate America. True power never has to shout. It never has to throw a tantrum, wear designer silk, or belittle those who appear weak. It is perfectly silent. It only requires a simple signature and the quiet patience to wait for the arrogant to inevitably destroy themselves. I leaned back in the comfortable leather, feeling the satisfying weight of the moment. I slowly lifted my gaze toward the ceiling, tucked quietly into the shadowed corner of the elegant room. The tiny red light of a security camera blinked rhythmically in the silence. We want to sincerely thank you from the bottom of our hearts for taking the time to listen to today's story. We would love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Please drop your location in the comments below. If you found today's story captivating and satisfying, please remember that our channel is facing a strict monetization block and will unfortunately no longer be uploading new videos here in the near future. We are officially transitioning our full operations to Patreon. We ask that you please help support us by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon community. There, you can listen to our absolute best, exclusive true stories that we simply cannot make public on YouTube. You can easily join by scanning the QR code currently displayed on your screen, or by using the direct link provided in the video description or the pinned comment. Thank you again, and we hope to see you there.